Continue. We started yesterday from the Maamer. But just first, a small preface. A very interesting idea that in the Sikha before the Maamer, the Rebbe brings something which we mentioned already in earlier lessons, in previous Mamarim. And the Rebbe brings that in davening of Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, it says in Zohar that there's 3 times that we mention Uvechein. Now in our Tefillah we mention Uvechein 4 times. Where does the 4th time come from? And so the Rebbe says that the 4th Uvechein is corresponding to the Uvechein of the Megillah, Uvechein Ave El HaMelech Asher Lo Chadas. Since it's Lo Chadas, it's improperly, that's why it's not part of our davening, there's only 3 of them. But nevertheless, we have it there. It's not mentioned as part of davening, but nevertheless, it's there. Lo Chadas is there extra. What's the idea of Lo Chadas? Sometimes there's a situation where a person is told that he can't come into the king. He can't come into the Chatzer HaPnimis, in the inner courtyard, without being called. And Ani lo nikreisi lave el hamelech zeh shloshim yom. It's already been 30 days since I've been called. And nevertheless, being and knowing the fact that the king is there, he pushes himself in Lo Chadas, even if it's not properly and it's not right, he makes sure to push himself in. And the Rebbe says, when we see that there's no eitzah, that there's no other way, we push ourselves in Shaloi Chadas. And when we push ourselves in Shaloi Chadas improperly, then we get the Sharvit HaMelech, we get the royal scepter of the king, and not just the Rosh HaSharvit, the head of the scepter, as it's explained in Mamarim, the tip of the scepter, but even the entire scepter. This is the idea of Purim, and this is the concept that we're talking about. That there's a time when it's an inyan nifla, when it makes no sense. It makes no sense that in a time when the Jewish people are in such a low, both physically and spiritually, if when they were on a high they couldn't receive the Torah fully, how's it possible? It makes no sense. It's nifla that they should be able to accept it and receive it fully when they're on a low. And yet it's Lo Chadas. The receiving of the Torah is that this is the way it is. That the Jewish people, Vekibel Hayehudim, that specifically in this way is how we receive the Torah. And it's the same thing, the general idea of Purim. That Purim, there's a mitzvah of Ad Lo Yada. We don't know the difference. And it's explained, there's various explanations in Chassidus, but one of the explanations that the Rebbe brings from Kisvei Arizal is Ad Lo Yada ben Arer Haman leBaruch Mardchai, is that a person comes to a state where he's able to say Baruch Haman. Not, God forbid, the opposite regarding Mardchai, but regarding Haman, that a person can say Baruch Haman. Why? Because there's the good that's there, and that we bring down the bracha to draw down the elokus even into the klippas, to be mevarer and elevate the klippas. But in a state of yada, that's impossible, because if a person knows and a person is in a state of knowledge and he says chas v'shalom such a thing, then he's bringing life and sustenance to the klippa itself. But when he's in a state of lo yada, when he's in a total bittul, when he's in a state that he doesn't exist, and he doesn't have any knowledge, he doesn't have any concept of understanding, but rather the thing is the way it is because that's the way it is, and it doesn't have to make sense, then he can even bring chayas alokus into the klippas until he brings out the good and the sparks of godliness into the klippa, and in this way gets rid of Haman. This idea is what it's all about, and specifically connected to now, a few days before Purim, the Tes Adar, which is the day that the Frierdiker Rebbe came to America. When the Frierdiker Rebbe came to America, it was in a way of Lo Chadas. It made no sense. The Frierdiker Rebbe writes that the 10 days on the ship were like Aseret Simei Tshuva. It was someone who was not afraid of anything. He wasn't afraid of the communists, he wasn't afraid of the Germans, he wasn't afraid of anything, and yet when it came to coming to America, the Frierdiker Rebbe said he was afraid. Here he's coming to a state that makes no sense. And it's an interesting thing because we find that right before the Gula, that Moshe was afraid of Parai, to the extent that Hashem had to tell him, Bayel Parai. When it comes to coming to the klippa, to be able to elevate the lowest klippa, to have to stand up and say America is nicht anders, something which no one is able to accept, something which is lo chadas, something that's lo yada, makes no sense. To be able to bring Baruch, the Chayos of Elokus, into it until taking out the sparks of godliness, so the klippa disappears, and on the contrary it becomes and it's transformed into Kedusha. That's something which is lo chadas. That's something that makes no sense. It's a davar nifla. It's something amazing. It's a davar pella. It's something that has no place in Seichel. It has no place in Seichel. That in our generation, in the lowest place and in the lowest time, specifically now is the time when the Gula comes. It makes no sense in Seichel, and yet that's the reason why it happens now. And it's the same thing with every person specifically. That a person sometimes says, who am I and how can I come to the king? I know who I am, I know where I'm holding, I know my place. And we say, Avel HaMelech, when there's no other Eitzah, we come Lo Chadas, and that's how we get to the king, and we get to something even deeper than when it's Chadas. And that's also what the idea of the Mesirus Nefesh, that the Frierdiker Rebbe explains in the Maimer, that the Jewish people had then. That they had a Mesirus Nefesh for Torah and Mitzvahs. They had a Mesirus Nefesh for Torah and Mitzvahs, one that made no sense. It wasn't just a Mesirus Nefesh not to convert. That entire year, no one even thought a thought of Masheves Chutz. But a Mesirus Nefesh for Torah and Mitzvahs, that despite the fact that the Goyim were strong and powerful and they believed that they could do whatever they wanted, the Jews still had Mesirus Nefesh. The same Jews who up until then didn't see a need for Torah and Mitzvahs. The same Jews who up until then were Nenu Misudas Shaloi Sirasha. And yet they had then Mesirus Nefesh for Torah Mitzvahs. Mesirus Nefesh to be able to learn Torah and do Mitzvahs. And even more than that, to do what it wasn't even demanded of them. Lahakil Kilas Barabim, to gather people publicly and learn Torah, despite the fact that it's not a mitzvah and it's not a halacha that you have to do that. And this Mesirus Nefesh is something which brought them to the fact that now they were able to do such an amazing davar pella, to be able to fully accept the Torah now, because even though in the time of Matan Torah was only the beginning. And the Mesirus Nefesh, the Frierdiker Rebbe explains in the Maamer, was brought by Mordechai Yehudi, was the Moshe of his generation. What was Mordechai's avodah that he used to learn Torah with Jewish children, to the extent that the Jewish children were so connected and so inspired by Mordechai Yehudi that when Haman HaRasha came and Mordechai said to the children, run away, why should you get burnt by my coal, by my fire? Haman hates me. He's now going to punish you, like Haman actually said, I'm going to start with the children. And yet the children said, we're with you. It was children. Young children. But the Mesirus Nefesh that was inspired in the Mordechai Yehudi was such that they said, we accept whatever punishment is meant for us as long as we don't have to separate from the Torah and from our teacher who teaches us Torah. That's the idea and that's the concept of the explanation of how this davar pella happened, this wondrous thing happened. Now the Rebbe, in the next two Oisius and Ois Beis and Gimel of the Maamer, asks three powerful questions. And we know also that when a question is asked in a Maamer, from the question itself we already see the concept of what's going to be explained later. The first question the Rebbe asks is that if the whole point is that they had Mesirus Nefesh, what's the difference? Who was the one who inspired their Mesirus Nefesh? And what's the difference? What his avodah was, the fact that his avodah was to learn Torah with Jewish children. Now from this we see and we deduce that it's not just Mesirus Nefesh itself that was able to bring them to accept the Torah specifically at that time, at the time of Achashverosh. But it was more than Mesirus Nefesh. It was the type of Mesirus Nefesh they had. It was the way, it was the fact that the Mesirus Nefesh was one that was inspired by Mordechai Yehudi, by the leader of the generation. And the fact that the leader of the generation is Avodah, was Avodah with the Jewish children. The other question that Rebbe asks is a very powerful question. In the Maamer, when the Frierdiker Rebbe asked the question, and he says that it's a wondrous thing, he says that at the time of Kabbalah Torah, when the Jewish people accepted the Torah, when they said Nasa v'Nishma, they were on the highest level, both physically and spiritually. They were on the spiritual eye as well as the physical eye. Also, when he talks about this all-time low that they were in the time of Achashverosh, he talks about how both physically and spiritually they were in the lowest level. And the Rebbe says, the important thing over here is to accept the Torah. And as we explained earlier, accepting the Torah means allowing godliness to come into the world. Allowing the godliness to be able to be accepted and received by the human beings, by the physical world down here. For that, the important point is the spiritual high and the spiritual low. At the time of a spiritual high, it makes sense that the Torah, the godliness can come into the world. At the time of a spiritual low, it doesn't make sense. What's the difference? The fact that they were also on a physical high and a physical low. Now, the way we're going to see in the Maimer, but what we already see from the question is a very interesting point. What we see already from the question is that actually, Torah and mitzvahs is not just about my spiritual inspiration. It's not just about how spiritually I get inspired. Torah and mitzvahs is a connection to my physical status. To the extent that my physical status makes a difference, that there will be a question of how can I accept the Torah at a time when I'm a spiritual high or a physical high or a physical low. It's not that Torah wasn't given down here only to spiritual, to neshamas. The Torah was given to neshamas begufim, so that a physical person down here can fulfill the Torah. But the Rebbe will explain that idea more at length later. Now, the Rebbe asks another question, which is a much more basic question. And that is, how in general do we have the concept that Mesirus Nefesh is what's necessary in order to accept the Torah fully? Fine, Mesirus Nefesh is a great and amazing, important thing. But what does that have to do with accepting the Torah? The Torah is about living. The Torah says, V'chai b'hem. Our Torah is a Torah of life which Hashem wants to neshamas begufim, and like we explained in the last question, down here in the physical world. Why would Mesirus Nefesh be a prerequisite to accept the Torah? The Torah is not about Mesirus Nefesh. Sure, there is a mitzvah in the Torah that at certain times a person should give up his life even for Hashem. But that's one mitzvah out of 613. All the other 612 mitzvahs, the essence of what they're all about is live. There are 3 mitzvahs about which we say, Yehareg val yaver, that a person should rather give his life up than transgress these mitzvahs. But it's not that this is the mitzvah. The mitzvah is to do it while alive. The mitzvah goes to the extent that even if a person has to give up his life, he should be prepared to give his life up. But the idea of giving one's life up for Kiddush Hashem is not what Torah is. It's an amazing thing, it's a powerful thing, but why should that be for accepting the Torah down here? Torah has to be done by a living person. And the Rebbe goes on to offer a possible explanation, and it's a very interesting idea, that in Tanya it says that the reason why Moshe Rabbeinu told the generation that went into Eretz Yisrael that they should say Krishma twice a day, which means the mitzvah of Krishma was only said in Parshas Va'eschanan, the mitzvah of saying Krishma twice a day. These were the people who were about to go into Eretz Yisrael. Was that twice a day a Jew has to remember Hashem Echad, Hashem is one, V'ahavtas Hashem Elokecha v'chol levavcha v'chol nafshecha. I'm ready to give my life up even in order to recognize the oneness of Hashem. Now these people, they were about to go into Eretz Yisrael, they didn't have to deal with Mesirus Nefesh. Hashem promised them, Pachdechem u'meirachem yitein avaya. Hashem will place the fear of Hashem upon all the nations that are around them, upon everyone, even the animals. So there was no problem and no issue that they had to worry about being Meiser Nefesh. Why then did Moshe Rabbeinu tell them twice a day they should say Krishma? And the Alter Rebbe explains that the fulfilling the Torah and its mitzvahs is dependent on Mesirus Nefesh. To understand that, in short, when the Jewish people were in the Midbar, they didn't have to deal with the world. They were separate from the world. A person wanted to eat food, he had man. A person needed to wash his clothes, he had the anan. A person needed a new pair of clothes, he didn't need this, clothes grew with him. There was no business issues, there was nothing. All they did was they learned Torah with Moshe Rabbeinu all day. They had nothing to take them away from it. Now they're about to go into Eretz Yisrael. They're going into Eretz Yisrael into a situation where they have to deal with the world. Where when a person comes, he wakes up in the morning, his children are hungry, they want food. How does he feed them? He has to go work. If you don't work, you don't make food. Comes Shabbos, you can't work, but the fact is that I don't have enough food, I don't have enough money, what should I do? So there's something that's taking him away from doing what's right. Comes the idea of Hasagas Gvul, that if I'm not going to do what everyone else does for the competition, then I'm going to not be as honest, or not be as honest in the way I deal with other people, then I won't have food, or that's at least what the Yetzer Hara tells me. So now there's a Yetzer Hara. Now I work hard 6 days a week, and it comes the morning of Shabbos when I'm not working, and I want to sleep extra. Misman Krishma. Now there's a reason to think there's something that pushes me to perhaps go against Torah mitzvah. Says the Alter Rebbe, the way to fulfill it is remember that I would even be prepared to give my life up for Hashem. That power that I'm even ready, v'ahavtas Hashem alekecha, twice a day I say, Hashem is one and I'm ready to give my life up to Hashem, enables me to give up things which are easier than giving my life up, to give up the taivas or to give up the desires that I have. So we see that Mesiras Nefesh is necessary. But the Rebbe says that Mesiras Nefesh is a potential Mesiras Nefesh, the fact that I would be willing to give my life up. At the time of Matan Torah, when they said Nasim Nishma, they were also willing to give their life up. Why did they need actual Mesiras Nefesh? That's seemingly something that doesn't have to do with fulfilling Torah and mitzvahs.